evening and welcome to Stories of Solidarity, Artist Talk and Panel Discussion with the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center Artist in Residence, Marisa Morán Jahn. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our former director, Karen Farber, Marisa and Rafi Segal, as well as our other panelists. You will meet them in a moment. I'm Melissa Noble, the Interim Managing Director of Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center, and this discussion is one of the programs associated with the 2021 Artist in Residence Spotlight exhibit at the Blaffer Art Museum. And that exhibit includes two of our other artists in residence, Sean Leonardo and Brandon Ballinger. The Artist in Residence program is one of the many supported by the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center on the main campus of the University of Houston. And that includes scholarships, fellowships, performances, exhibitions, and scholarly research. Through these programs, we convene students, faculty, artists, and community members to work as interdisciplinary catalysts and collaborators that stimulate dialogue to bridge boundaries, share knowledge, and innovate experimental art. I'd like to introduce my co-director, Stephen Maticio. He is the director and head curator of the Blaffer Art Museum, as well as the artistic director of Cynthia Woods Mitchell. He'll be introducing you to our panelists and the topic for tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Yes, I just want to share the welcome to everyone, both our panelists as well as our audience, and to encourage everyone who is in the Houston area to come and see the exhibition. Right now, our Artist in Residence Spotlight is up through April 25th, and I highly encourage you to come see and just see a piece and a reflection of the very expansive projects that all three artists have been sort of enacting and activating over the course of this past academic year. I am actually going to introduce our moderator for the evening, who I think will then introduce Marisa, Rafi, and our panelists. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce Karen Farber, who is the VP of External Affairs at the Buffalo Bayou Partnership and the longstanding and very pioneering director of the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center for the Arts. Karen has held former positions at Jacob's Pillow Dance Festival and the Houston Grand Opera, and has a background in performance studies and experimental theater from the NYU Tisch School of the Arts. And so I am now going to hand it over to Karen. And thank you so much, Karen, for being here and leading this discussion this evening.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. I look so fondly back on my very recent days at the Mitchell Center, and I spent 15 years there. So a big chunk of my life, a real passion project for me. And it's really quite thrilling to see it in such able hands now with you and Melissa, and to see the manifestation of these residencies that were sort of, burgeoning projects when I left last year turn into really incredible residencies and an exhibition at the Blaffer that I just had the chance to see over the weekend. So really, really exciting. In particular, I'm quite thrilled to be introducing one of my very favorite artists, Marisa Jahn, and her collaborator, Rafi Segal, who I've gotten to know quite well recently through your many visits to Houston. Marisa and I was asked to really talk about the origin of this, this project. And so I'll talk about it from a personal perspective and also Marisa's amazing background. But Marisa and I met through a foundation that's called Creative Capital, which funds very ambitious visionary projects by artists. And I've served, and I think Stephen has as well, as a consultant for Creative Capital. And as a result, I get to go to these artist retreats sometimes in the summertime and hear from lots and lots of artists about their projects. And the project that at that time Marisa was talking about is a project called Video Slink Uganda, which was, I'm probably going to butcher the description of it, but basically sneaking short art videos onto the beginning of VHS tapes that were available for rent in Uganda. Hopefully that was sort of right, Marisa. And it was an example, for me of the quite activist and also extremely creative and humorous projects that Marisa was capable of making. But little did I know all of the other ones at that time that she had under her belt and that she was envisioning for the future. So we met a couple of years of those retreats, and then I finally got to hear a bit more about her practice, particularly her past practice with domestic workers, which has been a longtime practice of hers. And she'll, I'm sure, talk a bit about that background herself as well. Marisa teaches at MIT and also some other institutions. I know you've taught at in the past, and I'm not sure if you're still currently teaching at the New School, but I know that was a recent post that you had as well. And so one of her amazing collaborators at MIT is Rafi Segal, an architect. And Rafi is, he's also an associate professor of architecture and urbanism at MIT, and specializes in planning as well, and really has piloted this project that we're going to hear about today. So with that, I think I will hand it off to Marisa to maybe get us started, and you'll introduce the other participants in this panel as well.
Great. Okay. I'm going to post their bios in the chat. Oh, I cannot do that. I'm wondering, Melissa, could you post their bios in the chat? And then, but I think it's, so in terms of the genesis of what we're going to hear tonight, so we asked June, with whom I've collaborated for many years now, to speak first about her experience as a caregiver, and to paint a picture of caregiving from her perspective. She is with the Miami Worker Center, and I met her a few years ago when I was producing a film that has since come out on PBS. And when but actually before that, June, we met at an early We Dream in Black initiative at NDWA, probably in 2016 or 2017. And it was one of the early meetings where there's a nascent sense that there was something very specific and structural about the challenges and opportunities that Black domestic workers face. And so when you meet June as a person, she is super heartfelt, and you also understand how much how much she understands herself within this larger trajectory of social justice and historical, making how we make history through sharing our stories and our voices and perspectives. June has since introduced me to a number of colleagues at Miami Worker Center and others, including Lauren Simmons, who I just had the pleasure of meeting and interacting with in Houston, who's also who comes from a labor organizing background, and then moved into working with National Domestic Workers Alliance within the We Dream in Black initiative. And I think one of the things that was really remarkable that came out in the walking tour that she gave to Rafi and I in Houston, as well as through the co-design session that we did, was just the generosity that you also manifest in your organizing work, and the solidarity networks, I think, was really interesting to hear about how they take particular form in Houston and so forth. So I've had the pleasure of working with June for many years, both through the film. I've also had June be a guest speaker in a class I taught at MIT, and someone who I just really connect with frequently, and as you'll see, is inspiring to many people. She's also a Dorothy Bolden Fellow of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and so I'm excited to bring all these threads together. So with that, June, if you would share with us some of your experience of working as a caregiver and so forth. And hold on, let's see if I can unmute you. Oh.
Like every single meeting, sorry. Yeah, so good evening, everyone. And it's such a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you so much, Marisa, for this invite. Yeah, so my name is June Barrett. I am a Jamaican immigrant. I've been living here in the US since 2001. I have been a domestic worker for a little bit over 20 years. When I came to the United States of America, caregiving was definitely not on my mind. So I worked as a nanny, I worked in a factory, and then I was undocumented for a long time. So my sister said to me, why don't you come to Miami and do care work? So I left Connecticut and I came to Miami. I went straight into a care work because the client was in Mount Sinai Hospital. I walk into the room not knowing anything about taking care of the elderly. And she said, oh my God, they sent me a N-word. So that was my introduction into care work. But something happened while taking care of Mela. I started having flashback of my grandmother who was bedridden for many years. And my grandmother literally rot in the bed from bed sores. And I thought to myself, you know what? My grandmother didn't give the care. Here I am with a grumpy old lady. I'm going to give her just the best care ever. And that was what I did. Mela and I became great companions, great friends. And, after that, I got certified and I worked, decided to stay in the field. But there was a lot of abuse. Oh my God. One of the most frequent abuse was either having your wages stolen, not getting paid on time, constantly have to ask for your money. And sometimes when you get it, it's short. I remember one boss asked me, didn't I pay you last week? What did you do with that money? And so these were some of the abuses. It was sexual harassment, it was verbal, it was sometimes physical. And I didn't have anywhere to turn. I didn't know what to do. But somewhere I heard about domestic workers organizing in New York. And I remember my sister and other domestic workers, when we would get our little couple hours day off on a Saturday, we would, be downtown and we'd be saying among ourselves, I wonder if the same people in New York, if they're coming to Miami to help us, not knowing at the time that we could have organized among ourselves. But a glimmer of hope came in 2016, the beginning. I got a call from the Miami Workers Center saying that we're now going to be organizing domestic workers. And I said, when is the meeting? And they gave me the date for the meeting. I was the first one in the meeting. And for some reason, they didn't call me back. But in July of that year, this might have been January, in July, I was at home in Jamaica, and I got a call from her then director, Marcia Olivo, and she asked me, June, are you willing to tell your story about sexual harassment? Because we can't find a care worker to tell their stories. And I said yes. So we had an assembly that July, and I spoke about, the horrific sexual violence, I experienced. There were many other stories, horrific stories told by, domestic workers. At that convening, it was over 500 workers coming together to tell their stories and to demand change, in the industry. After that, I went back to my job the next day, which was Sunday, and I called my client's daughter to come over. She came quickly and she thought I was quitting. And I said, no, but I was at a gathering of domestic workers yesterday. And one thing I know, if this movement call me, I'm going to be, I'm going to be a part of it. I'm going to answer. But if you're going to fire me, give me 2 weeks notice. And Judy Arberman looked at me and she said, no, if this is something that you want to do, we will work around you. And our father then was 89 years old, and he wrote a check. He got up, went over to his desk, wrote a check, and he said, give this to the organization. And later on, I became very vocal, traveling across the country, specifically speaking about sexual harassment, because globally, sexual harassment in domestic work is taboo. People don't talk about it. And so I was hell-bent, and it was revisiting trauma after trauma, but it was important for me to talk about it. And then the Me Too movement, and then I became one of the leading spokesperson in the Me Too movement. We're still doing Me Too stories, collaboration with UN Women. A few months ago, we had a big Me Too Moving Forward conference in Iceland, and also globally with UN Women. So I'm still a part of that conversation around sexual harassment. Have done many organizing work. I've worked, the GOTV, fighting for healthcare here in Florida. I'm also advocate for trans liberation, trans and queer liberation. So as a domestic worker, I'm a queer domestic worker. I have issues before now as a domestic worker, no benefit, no healthcare. So my organizing work is very intersectional, because as a domestic workers, our lives are at so many different crossroads. So our fight is harder. In 2016, I met Marisa in Washington, DC. She was minding her own business, and I just went over to her because I was nervous. It was a large gathering of domestic workers. And Marisa stopped what she was doing, and that was very important. And she paid attention to this nobody who came and said, hi, how are you? And after that, couple of months later, I got a call from the Miami workers saying, hey, NDAA is doing a project. Would like for you to be a part of the project. And I said, okay. I went that Saturday evening, and we were all waiting for this lady to arrive, and it was Marisa. And immediately I know that she already, I built trust with Melissa. So when I saw it was Melissa, I immediately became so excited, and tell my colleagues, other domestic worker, oh, she's cool, blah, blah, blah. So we ended up working with Marisa and this project that literally changed my life, literally changed the way that my employers think, and literally changed other women who are part of my care team, and touched the lives of domestic workers here in South Florida, touched the heart of my boss. My 96-year-old client fell in love with Marisa. So she literally came in and she changed our lives. And after Melissa left, Mr. Person had a conversation with it was 6 of us on the care team. Marisa met most of the people who are on the care team. And Mr. Person said, what can I do to make every one of you lives even, much better than it is now? So we all had a big meeting, after Marisa left, and the following day, and a lot of changes were made on the job. So thank you, Marisa, for that. Marisa invited me to MIT this past summer. And for me, it was deeply moving to see these young people who were, was using art as a way to connect with care. For me, that was a powerful moment. It was fitting because a few days ago, my supervisor called me and she said, oh, there's a meeting at NDAA. I'm not sure why you're not invited into this meeting, but I'm sending you an invite. So it was a meeting around a campaign, Care is Essential campaign. I got into the meeting and people were talking, strategizing. And in my head, I'm thinking, why is Marisa not in this meeting? So after the meeting, someone said to me, one of my coworkers said, we haven't heard from June. Why you have been quiet, throughout the whole meeting. And I said, listen, can we have Marisa Jahn be a part of this, be sitting at this table? And someone said to me, do you know her? And I said, yes. And I said, okay, I'll do the connecting. And the chief strategist said, can I get a hookup too? And, and then we did that. And out of that, the collaboration with my colleague, Lauren happens. And I'm very excited. And I'm hoping that, I'll be able to do, more collaboration work with Marisa. So that are some of the things that I remember. So I am now one of the Dorothy Bolden Fellows and at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, as Marisa said. And I work specifically with We Dream in Black, which I think Lauren will touch on. But for me, We Dream in Black initiative and program is very, very dear to my heart, because when I first came on the very first assembly, believe it or not, over 500 women, I was the only Black domestic worker. Everyone else was Latinx, and I felt disconnected. So in 2016, again, so many things happened in 2016. I was invited to the first convening, and I made a decision that building out a strong Black Afro base, is something that I want to do, and is something that I've been doing. And I was on the ground, Lauren, when we started the We Dream in Black Houston. I was one of the organizers there on the ground, and it's been an amazing journey. Thanks.
So I also want to let people know that June and Lauren's bios are in the YouTube, I guess, the post, the live feed, so you can find it there. And then, yeah, so a good segue to Lauren. Lauren, we'd love to hear about We Dream in Black, and also in particular about the specific challenges that domestic workers in Houston face, and your organizing strategies, and what are challenges and opportunities?
Definitely, I'll try to tackle that. So hi, everybody, I'm Lauren Simmons, and I am the lead organizer for the Houston chapter. We Dream in Black is an initiative which was, I want to say, formulated in 2015 with the intention on focusing and organizing Black domestic workers and making sure that their stories and voices are amplified, but also paying special attention to some of the unique challenges and barriers that affect Black domestic workers specifically. Within our WeDib chapters, we have Black domestic workers from all walks of life, Black immigrants, and we're mainly consist of mostly women. I think what's really important about We Dream in Black is the fact that it really kind of points to a legacy of organizing and a history of Black domestic workers kind of really taking control over their working conditions and understanding that the work that they do is important, even long before we even were coining terms essential workers, and that these jobs exist because they're necessary, but they should be good jobs. We've always fought, we've always organized, and Black domestic workers are no different. They have not been victims, but they've actually been their own champions in their stories. And so our chapter is one of the newest chapters formulated. We actually were kind of birthed right in the midst of COVID-19. So not only did our chapter formulate because of the present and needs that needed addressing for Black domestic workers, but there was a compounding crisis with COVID-19. A lot of our chapter members, saw themselves without work or being faced with the kind of it's not even really an option, a very precarious option of, if you leave here, you may not be able to return to work, or you can stay. And that's not really an option. And so the beauty of National Domestic Workers Alliance being able to helping the organizing initiatives and helping us grow as a chapter, but also being able to provide some relief for our members through the Coronavirus Care Fund. And that's really what kind of helped us bridge and build those connections as a brand new growing chapter, trying to figure out how to organize and grow and tackle issues without being able to meet in person, was important. It was a not so much a Band-Aid solution, but it was an opening door for us to be able to, meet and work with other domestic workers. I think really for us, the organizing that happens within our chapter is member-led. And I think that's what has helped us grow so much. Our members have a very, very strong understanding of what their issues are. Sometimes it's not even a case of not knowing who to yell at, but not having the space and the opportunity to feel like these issues are not happening to me in a vacuum, that these issues are happening in industry-wide, and there has to be some type of strategic solution. It's not going to just be able to be me up against my employer one-on-one. I need to be with an organization. I need to be with my colleagues and other domestic workers to really change the way domestic work is viewed and the way we are treated and compensated. And I think it's really important to note as well that domestic work for a lot of our members is work that they want to do. This is not work that they fell into. This is not work that they, are doing grudgingly. A lot of my domestic workers, this is a dream job. They are experts in their field. They are innovative when it comes to methods of care. They can, there are so many ways and so many areas of expertise within the care industry that I'm learning about, not even from the organization itself, not even from any like history or text. I'm learning from my domestic workers because they, like I said, they study their field, they're experts in their field. And so that's kind of been a really, really eye-opening and challenging experience for me, because this is one of the first times where I'm being educated in an organizing position by members, kind of in a reverse of what I usually have to do when I'm going out and recruiting members and some of my past experiences. And so, like I said, June is such an amazing force within our chapter, and not within our chapter, but I use them a lot as an example of what your activism and what your work can lead into. Because I'm sure, as June shared in their story, initially, being an activist probably wasn't on the front of their minds. But when you're confronted with issues in an industry that you love and a job that you're not going to leave anytime soon, you have to make some really, really serious and tough decisions. And so I think for me, what we do really well with NDWA is making sure that our folks can find each other. Education is important, civic engagement, all of those things are very, very important. But before you can do any of that, people have to find each other and be able to build community and organically address issues. You get folks in a room and let them talk long enough, they're gonna talk shop. Work issues are gonna come up. That's just a given. You don't have to force that. But what I truly believe that we have in our chapter that's so amazing and what helps us really push forward is the idea of community and accountability to each other. The challenges within domestic work are kind of like what June shared. A lot of it really boils down to this work is devalued because of the type of work that it is and because who does it. Domestic work is overwhelmingly done by Black women and immigrant women of color. And so if we think about the way, our society even, addresses those identities and deals with those identities, then we know that the reason that this work is treated like this and there are so many problems faced by workers is because it's just not seen as, we just don't value the work that these folks do, and we don't value them as people. Even with COVID happening and we're deeming folks essential workers, we're still having conversations about whether those workers are deserving of $15 or not. Which in the case of domestic workers, for an example, a lot of them are not even covered fully by federal minimum wage laws. So we're, talking about fighting for 15 when it's still perfectly legal to underpay domestic workers. And a lot of times, just within the power dynamic itself, employers simply there isn't a lot of incentive for them to do the right thing. There's not a lot of policies in place. There's not a system of accountability that can even really penalize employers. And so it's really important for domestic workers to be organized, for them to be in communication with each other, but even more so beyond that, mobilizing and building power, because for us to see real change in this industry, we're going to have to be at our state legislature. We're going to have to be at our city council and demanding changes, because a lot of times when you're working in an individual's home, you are kind of just subject to the rules of the land in that home. And it's very isolating work. And so I think that's what's like really important about our organization, is that we kind of remove that barrier of isolation so folks can address their issues and really figure out what they want to see change in their industry. And if I can definitely talk more, but I'll pause there.
Well, I do want to ask you about the both of you about some of the housing issues and housing precarity that domestic workers face in Houston or Miami. If you want to say a few words here, and then we can also continue in the conversation afterwards.
So I'll say for Houston, the issue is that we're a city that is transforming, in a lot of those places that used to be affordable through gentrification is pushing folks further to the outskirts of the city. So not only is it becoming just a housing issue, but it's also a transportation accessibility issue. A lot of our folks are being moved to the southwest side of Houston, so like the A-Leaf area, Greens Point in the north side, when a lot of our Black and Brown populations used to be really more concentrated in like my neighborhood, for example, 3rd Ward, 2nd Ward, and 5th Ward, in the 4th Ward area, which is called Freedmanstown. And so that changing landscape of the city really does bring in the issue of displacement and just even the power structure within that, because there's a lot of folks who even move out of Houston proper. And so that really changes the political landscape. And so domestic workers are not even able to have that same type of collective voice politically, because we're dispersed so far out and spread out throughout the city.
Yes, here in Miami, late last year, a lot of domestic workers were having housing crisis, because although they were not able to work, because at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of workers lost their jobs, which means that they could not pay their rent. So although there was some kind of a rent protection, the landlords didn't care. They were still turning up for their rents, and a lot of them, domestic workers, were made homeless or were constantly bombarded by landlords. We have such a crisis that our housing meeting any one time could have up to 100 and something domestic workers trying to get legal help. So we partnered with Community Justice Project, which is a really dope local organization with a bunch of brilliant lawyers who came together to help domestic workers to stay in their homes. So right now, I think Miami Worker Center is also partnering with Rights to the City, so they can get much needed support and help for domestic workers. Miami Worker Center is not a service organization, but unfortunately, they were forced to kind of become one since the pandemic. So right now, workers are getting all the help they need to stay in their homes. Workers are also connecting among themselves in terms of mutual aids to see where they can find and get resources, in terms of cash to help, pay their rents. But right now, we are having a housing crisis here, and it's domestic workers, low wage folks who are, getting the brunt of this. I live here in this rundown old shack in Kendall, and it's if it wasn't for like my sister and I, where both of us come together, so we're able to stay in our apartment. The rent is out of control. There's no rent control. Landlords can kick you out, whether or not it's a pandemic. I've seen it here in my complex. So housing is definitely, has become a human rights crisis here in South Florida. And domestic workers are, and still they think $15 an hour is too much for women, and men also do this job, who leave their homes to go into people's homes to take care of their precious gift, their child or their children, to take care of the elderly. Right? And you are saying that, you are essential, but you're not deserving of respect, your dignity. You're not deserving of $15 an hour. So we can pay our rents, we can afford healthcare. A lot of domestic workers die because of the coronavirus. Why? Because they did not have the money to turn up to a doctor's office, right? So we are suffering. We are suffering because people do not value our work, do not value us, do not want to pay us a livable wage. And I'm hoping that, that can change with the Biden administration focusing somewhat and putting some money into the care industry.
And just really quick.
Oh, sorry, Lauren, go ahead.
No, really quick. Just wanted to add the average, I want to say hourly rate for domestic workers, Black domestic workers, is $12 an hour, and the yearly salary bumps at about $20K. So just imagine how hard it would be to find housing where you live in your neighborhood. Think about it right now. If you only had access to $20,000 a year, and that's the median. So that means there's people making far below that.
Yeah, it's really important to lay this out for people. And I want to get back to this conversation when we do a little bit of, Q&A at the end with each other. But I think it's also a really good segue to hearing, and I don't know, Marisa, if you want to talk about CareForce or if you want to dive right into talking about Carehaus, but I'll hand it back to you to sort of present some information about the project or projects, and then we can get to some dialogue.
Yeah, so I'll present a little bit of context that leads up to this project, Carehaus. So, okay, I'm sharing my screen. Oops. Do you see a big gray box here? Okay, so I'm gonna try and minimize it. So if you can't hear the sound, then let me know. I'm gonna minimize it. So can't see chat or anything, so just pipe up, please. So I just wanted to contextualize the work that I do. My training is both as an artist, alongside working as a community organizer and as an advocate specifically with low-wage workers, immigrants, youth, and women that have dovetailed a lot through the CareForce and Carehaus project. I use different media, so I go between photography and installation and graphics. These are Know Your Rights comics for migrant workers from Mexico. And this is a graphic pandemic toolkit that I produced with Latino Worker Justice Project in Williamsburg at the outbreak of the pandemic for domestic workers and specifically undocumented folks to understand their rights. And the way that I see my work and my role as an artist is really influenced in part by by Arabian Nights, which is a story also referred to as 1001 Nights, which is a story written by many women over many continents and many millennia. And it's a frame tale. It's an overarching story with different stories tucked in between. And so I see my role as an artist as creating this frame tale and allowing those voices to emerge. I'm gonna skip the video, but it's on my website if you're curious. But I'm really interested in the question and the role of imagination in transforming how we see ourselves and how we understand the world and build the world. This is a different project called Biblu Bandito, which started in 2008 and is ongoing. And it's a project that I initiated with the Library Club of El Pital, which is a rural community in Honduras, in northern Honduras, and where there's has been structurally ignored. And the community there has self-identified that to get themselves out of a poverty cycle, I'm using their own words, literacy was really important. And so after I went there and did a bookmaking workshop, to make it stick, we created this character named Biblu Bandito, which means story eater. Biblu Bandito eats stories, and little kids, he pesters little kids until they offer and feed him stories to nourish his insatiable appetite. So it's become this legend that started in El Pitan, Honduras, and then went to Nicaragua, came to the United States. And in Honduras, it's a project that the youth continue to lead on their own. And so to me, it's really inspiring example of the way in which imagination and creativity is not just one person inventing in a vacuum, but to refer to this author, Michel Serres, is this, it's like a game of ball. You know, the sense of exhilaration comes from not the ball lying on the ground, but me passing the ball to you, you passing it to somebody else, and in the circle. And it's a sense of exhilaration or ecstasy that creates this feeling of fulfillment and imagination. So, which takes us to the CareForce project, and which, just to locate it historically and kind of pick up where some of the tendrils that June and Lauren mentioned, one of the reasons why it's been historically devalued is because in the 1930s and 40s, domestic workers, along with street vendors and farm workers, were intentionally excluded from receiving the same rights as other workers because they were largely Black and African American. And for decades, that remained the case until the 2000s, when domestic workers in New York organized to pass, well, they organized and share their stories. Again, this interest, as in Arabian Nights and Biblu Bandito, the role of stories in informing lawmakers in Albany. And they passed the nation's first domestic workers Bill of Rights, which has then kicked off Bill of Rights in other states, in 7 other states. And as the movement started, well, so like at this time, domestic workers in New York reached out to my art and journalism team to create, well, what we created were these audio novellas, these stories where you can call in, and this is before smartphones were really available and accessible. You could call in to hear these short 2-minute stories about your rights, and they were kind of storified, and they're really funny and humorous. And it was we co-designed them with different workers in New York first. And as the movement started growing, to meet domestic workers where they're at, I created the nanny van. And so the nanny van would stop at places like a toddler storytime hour in front of the public library, or in front of a market or a transit stop. And it pops up, and we would share our audio novellas, also different policy toolkits that we had made. And we were essentially sharing, exchanging resources and stories within this movement that was just kind of getting going. And so the stories are really important also for inviting people to identify themselves as a domestic worker, a nanny, housekeeper, a caregiver, or as a domestic employer, and to understand that the laws are changing, and to understand themselves within this arc of history and what they can do, and how also they're implicated within this care crisis that we face in the United States. And along the way, we're creating different resources, such as these, we created this Bootylicious dance album that combines the voices of some of the women that I was recording along the journey. And this image on the record jacket comes up later in this presentation. There'll be a pop quiz. And then we created this
caregivers across the nation to choreograph a dance whose gestures, like shaking the sheets, make care work visible. Other gestures narrate the history of domestic work or point out strategies to move us forward.
So we would create these dance. That was a way of celebrating. I mean, we used it sometimes along in rallies when there was 100 domestic workers and advocates, and we walked 100 miles, 100 women, 100 miles. We use it to celebrate moments. Along with that, I was always producing different either digital artworks or interactive media or silkscreen, like these silkscreen prints, which were really about policy. The silkscreen prints for me was just about these like wanting to make beautiful wallpaper or make decorative these policies or these things that I was facing that really made me mad. And this is the film.
My name is Marisa Jahn, and this 1967 Mercury station wagon is the Careforce One, inspired by some of the incredible caregivers I've met. So Anjum, Toko, and I are going on an adventure from New York City to Miami.
There is one problem.
We left the lights on.
We don't know nothing about cars.
Care in America is undervalued.
People don't see us with a brain. They see us as just people who clean or wipe old people's spot. But we are more than that. How was your day?
They're often facing a larger degree of vulnerability because their immigration status is tied to their employer.
At the turn of the last century, 90% of African American women were in domestic work.
So there's a whole lot of changes that have to be done.
I hope you'll join us as we navigate car issues and care issues and find solutions to both from the amazing people we meet along the way.
So that's the film, which it's 4 episodes long. It's 24 minutes. You can find it linked from my website, which is my name, marisajahn.com. And I see that Anjum Acharya just joined the panel conversation, which is always exciting and an honor. Anjum was with me, my co-pilot in the nanny van and the Careforce One, and an honor to have as a co-pilot. So with that, okay, so now here's a segue to Rafi. So really after this film came out, it came out in 2018, and I thought that the project was, it was a decade long. I thought it would come to a close. And then I started thinking about throughout this whole project, I really have thought about, with my own struggles around care, with caring for my son and wanting to find ways to share care with my neighbors because the cost of care is so expensive. And also the experience I had with my paternal grandmother who was needing care and ended up she passed away a few years ago, very isolated in her own home, but very isolated. And so I just kept on thinking about how there was an architectural problem and how we needed to mutualize care and we need new spaces for that. And so in exploring or in querying what it would look like for our cities, our homes and our cities to center care. And also in this question about what would it look like to create a monument to care, as in, Anjum and my son and I went to DC and we saw these monuments to war and victory, and I'm explaining them to my son, and he's been very involved with me along this whole journey. And what I really wanted was, I just wanted to see a monument to the labor of care. And so I turned to my colleague Rafi Segal, who is known for designing spaces internationally that are around co-living spaces. Now I pass the baton.
Thanks. Yeah, such a kind of long and rich story here. Hi everyone, I'm Rafi Segal. I'm an architect. I'll share some of my work that kind of relates to co-living and maybe cohabitation more so here. Let me just get this going. You're seeing my presenter view. Hold on. Let me change screens for a second. Desktop 2. There we go. Now?
Yes.
Yeah. You're seeing just one slide, right?
Yes. This
Good,
just
good.
happened to me yesterday, Rafi, so I feel you.
All right. So I'll talk a little bit about a group I run at MIT called Future Urban Collectives, which deals with different forms of cohabitation. And part of the work that I'm doing with Marisa here relates to that directly. Our group really tries to find real world projects where students can learn, but also contribute to the community. And these vary in location and in size and in type. When I say type, some are architectural, some are urban, and some have a combination of both. So a few years ago, we had an opportunity to do a real project in Rwanda, which allowed MIT students to go there for a few weeks and build a prototypical village house with the community. And this was a unique opportunity for MIT students to kind of expand their experience, learn how to build in brick, but also learn from local traditions and contribute something back in terms of design and in terms of work. And one of these villages that we worked in, Mageragera, outside of Kigali, had that option and also had companies come in and contribute the material and send the mason workers that would then teach the MIT students and the villagers how to build in brick. So in a way, the villagers who lived in that village were kind of building and getting paid, of course, to build the home of their future neighbor, which was a fantastic experience for everyone. And a back and forth discussion with the local authority and the housing commission on how can we design houses that are better suited for the climate, that are more efficient, that also kind of have a more inspiring design. Some of these tests, as you can see here, the students with involved also local students from the University of Rwanda, from the architecture school. And eventually we build a prototype house that has various kind of environmental factors, like this kind of screen wall, and uses a straw, which is a local material, and has this kind of open room that each family could decide what to do with. There could be a shop, it could be an extensive kind of living area, which also works well with the climate. And this house, this prototype was given to a family. I won't go into the background of the families that receive these homes from the government. A lot has to do with displacement caused by various environmental risks and other reasons. You can see it collects water. It has kind of an outdoor space and various rooms inside that each family can decide how to divide. These houses are in rural lands, and it's part of a larger initiative to modernize the rural villages. So part of our work was also to prepare an urban plan for the village that allows more housing, but also establishes collective programs. You see in this drawing, the buildings in red are communal buildings that are shared by the entire community. And here, much of the inspiration comes from work I've been doing in Israel with kibbutz communities and the history of communal settlements, where various programs are shared across activities of the day, work, daycare, leisure, sports, etc. And the transformation of these communities in a plan you can see in finding new ways to revitalize this kind of communal living. These ideas then also translate into a series of co-living studies that we explore how non-family related people can live in a single building, in this case, usually relatively small, and benefit from shared spaces. And you can see these are few studies that eventually came to fruition in one project. And here with a group in Tel Aviv that manages to get hold of abandoned building and convinces a developer that purchased that building that while they are kind of waiting for the permitting or the reconstruction or sometimes the demolition, they could use that building as a co-living project to create more units, lower rent through shared spaces. And you see a kind of gradient that we started working with. The red is the most shared, the pink is what we call a group share, the cream color in this diagram is a semi-share. So not enough to say, oh, this is a space that everyone can share, but to create through design different types of spaces that can maintain your privacy, and each individual living in such a project can feel that they have control over when they decide to be with others and when they kind of decide to be alone. This building then, you see kind of the spaces that it generated, individual rooms, an artist studio, a workspace, and there's ongoing discussions with the tenants here on what kind of causes conflict, how to avoid conflict, how to manage the space. So part of the project of co-living or developing these new models of living has to do with community organizing and managing the shared amenities and the shared spaces. I'll quickly run through bringing that back into the US and seeing how some of these ideas can translate into our own cities. This is a project we did in New York City looking at empty office buildings, primarily in Midtown. You know, if we did it now post-COVID, it will probably quadruple because office buildings are really emptying out. This office building built in the 60s in Midtown has been just vacant because it's way too expensive to operate because it was done in a time that oil was very cheap. And also the tenants that are looking for office buildings want new buildings. So there are many of these office towers which stand abandoned. And the project here was to say, well, what can we do? How can we transform this abandoned office building into something else? Perhaps into a kind of urban block, but vertical, right? If you look at the New York City urban block, it's so diverse and rich. Can we then try and mimic that in a vertical organization? So you see here sketches that take different programs, whether it's residential, office, cultural, and commercial, and begin to stack them kind of in the tower, and then carve out open space throughout the entire building. So every floor has access to green space. It kind of spirals up into this long vertical spiraling park that hits all the floors. And here you see some images, and the typical office floor plan as is given by this building transforms into residential on the outskirts and shared programs inside. So again, the amenities on the inner part of the tower serve the residents, and smaller units can be organized, which are more affordable. So all these projects are retrofit, meaning we take existing structures and we retrofit them to different living conditions. In this last project that I'm showing, we're beginning now to actually create new buildings that would serve these different models of living. This project, Collective Block, takes an entire block in a port city of Haifa in Israel and changes those relationships by organizing units on the perimeter, sleeping in individual studios. And the inside of the block is given to a series of different shared spaces and courtyards. And then the ground level kind of remains open, so you kind of enter in and you engage the city through that. So some of these ideas translate into the Carehaus project that we'll describe soon, I guess.
So, and just a time check, it's a little after 7, at least Central Time. And so we have about 30 minutes left to both hear about Carehaus and have a dialogue.
Great. So I'll give some context to Carehaus. And so this is our team. You all can see the screen now? I'm hoping, yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so after Rafi and I teamed up and started thinking about this question, we then built out other parts of the team, which include Ernst Valerie, who's a Haitian American immigrant, a real estate developer and planner, and Ellen Iskovitz, who comes from the intersection between healthcare and finance. And we have a number of different local and national partners. So the context in which we're looking at is as adults age, they face increasing economic vulnerability. At the same time, caregivers face economic precarity. So 60% regularly skip meals in order to feed their own families and make ends meet. For both caregivers and those who need care, the toll of isolation takes, it is manifest both in terms of physical health and mental health. And so we're asking those questions about how what we are calling care-based co-housing might improve upon the social determinants of health, and how we can improve upon the environment to improve health and strengthen socioeconomic security. The way that Carehaus works is that older and disabled adults are paying a monthly amount for both housing and care, which supports the salary and benefits for caregivers as well as their families, and subsidizes their food. So where we want this idea of Carehaus to be situated is within the spectrum of care is between active living and assisted living. So I'm going to go ahead to what Carehaus is. So Carehaus is this idea of, our mission is that we want to provide quality care and homes for older and disabled adults, quality jobs and homes for caregivers and their families, provide sustainable neighborhood development. So development without displacement in a sense. We want to integrate art and contemporary design. So we seek to integrate telemedicine, for example. And, one of the key challenges in caregiving, as Lauren and June mentioned, is that it's an industry characterized by low wages and high turnover, which translates into a care gap that older and disabled experience. And during this care gap every year is when they're most likely to have return hospital admissions. And so we can quantify these are some of what we seek to provide. So now I go to the vision, and I'll kick it over to Rafi. So our vision is that, this idea of Carehaus is essentially found in this idea that older and disabled adults and people are integral to the well-being of our communities. And without their full participation, then democracy is at peril. That dignified care should be accessible to anyone who needs it, that caregiver stability directly impacts the health of older and disabled people in times of regular illness and crises, and art and storytelling enable us to live our fullest and should be accessible at each stage of our life. So I kick it to you, Rafi, if you want to just tell me when to advance.
Right. So we're looking at a view of the Carehaus Baltimore project, which is a 5-story building with 20 units. And you can see the ground level is retail on the corner, and the back kind of is slanted, and you see that view of an open courtyard in the center that allows light and air and creates terraces on each level. So open space is key here, that each floor has access to it, and each unit gets sufficient light from many directions and also access to open space. Next. So the project is located in Baltimore, in East Baltimore, in a neighborhood called Johnston Square. This map shows in purple vacancy in Baltimore, and we call it kind of the butterfly effect. As you can see, the east and west sides are more vacant, and the kind of the central spine is kind of dividing them. So part of the key realization here in working in Baltimore is the importance of the corner and the corner building in having a huge impact on the neighborhood through the kind of the junction of streets, as is the case with our project. Next. So the project ties into a vision plan that was endorsed by the community to revitalize, in a way, Johnston Square neighborhood. Next. And so also picking up on architectural language around, and here you see that view of Carehaus on the corner with a roof garden, and kind of looking into the courtyard, in which the individual units surround. Next. The two visions, the two views from the back and front. The pink represents, go right, thanks. The pink represents the shared spaces as they kind of move across the different floors. So all the units face the shared spaces. There are no corridors in the building. It allows easy access, and also this kind of two-way access that fits well with, adapts to pandemic times. Next. And various elements that are integrated into the design, whether it's like the shared spaces that you saw in the plan, or semi-open spaces of terraces, and green space. Next. Now, perhaps what enables all this is something that it's tied more to architectural medium, but what we call the building section. And you can imagine here a cut through the building where you see the pink kind of steps back, and that stepping back allows those open air terraces that also create open space, but also create this relation of viewing and participation between each floor through the open space. Next. And this is where our project begins to translate. So here in this model, which is at the Blaffer, you can see the view of Carehaus from the courtyard looking into those shared spaces, and each of these becomes an art project, in a way, a story. And each story then relates to the other. And two of these stories are now recreated or created, let's say, in real scale in the museum space. Marisa, you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the first story on the ground level, this story, so our third partner, Ernst Valerie, his way of identifying with Carehaus, and when we were first talking about it, he kept on talking about his mother, Clarice, who came from, she brought her 3 boys over from Haiti. And she is the kind of person where she would cook extra large meals that she could share with people who stopped by if they were hungry. She would make sandwiches for the garbage collectors who were Haitian American. She would save money in her mattress to be able to loan out, because it was hard to get a bank loan as a Black immigrant. She exemplifies what the Africana scholar and economist Jessica Nembhard Gordon characterizes as this really important anchor. And so Jessica writes about the importance of Black women as anchors in building a solidarity network and economy, and which becomes pronounced in moments such as the Underground Railroad, when people are mutualizing their resources and their wealth in order to get people over to freedom, which is a kind of an incredible act of faith. It's just an amazing thing. So I represented Clarice through this image of the lioness, which is a symbol of family pride, and in Clarice's way, this extended immigrant family pride. And also the tulip. And the tulip, you perhaps have seen that in wallpapers or kind of like an interior architecture, whatever. But the motif comes from Central Asia, around the area of Uzbekistan, before it went to Europe and Amsterdam, and before it came to the New World. So it's this very diasporic tulip. It's a symbol of love, in the way that the movement for domestic workers' rights is very diasporic. The second story is explores the role of voice in bolstering the movement for domestic workers' rights, which of course in turn strengthens the well-being of those who need care in working families. So I mentioned the record album that I produced a few years ago. You see these images here again. So you might remember some of these women from the film. So Aquilina Versosa Soriana is on the West Coast. She organizes Filipina domestic workers. Guillermina here, Castellanos, is one of the co-founders of National Domestic Workers Alliance. Narvada Chetri organizes Nepali domestic workers in New York City. Anya is, we had the honor of her working with my son, and she's still in our lives. And Diana Nucera is an amazing community organizer in Detroit. And then here, it's a little bit faint, but it's more visible in the Blaffer Museum. But here's June, and she's calling out. So all the women are calling. A lot of these women are singers, and they're using their voice to share their own story and becoming this kind of harmony. On the left here is Billie Holiday, who came to Harlem, and she was cleaning houses, and her mother was a domestic worker. Yeah, we segue over to Houston by pointing out that, this idea of, well, Carehaus, and this really came pronounced in our co-design sessions in Houston, was that while in Baltimore, we're looking at this housing typology of row houses, there's also other ways in which it can exist, from fitting into a block tower, to expanding on an urban block scale, as it could exist quite easily in Houston. So Rafi?
Right, just to say that the Carehaus concept is not tied to one building type, and it can adapt and fit to the building types in the neighborhood around it. So naturally, when we're working in Houston, we're working with a 1 or 2 story single family like condition. Although in this case, it's not a single family, it's a shared, what we call collective block, let's say, that has multiple units on it and a shared open space. If you can go ahead to the next slide. So a ground level plan would look something like that the units are organized in the perimeter. In the middle, there's open space and covered space, and there's a common room that looks over into that garden, and through which access to all the units is made possible. And the second level, next slide, we have the caregivers units that look onto the double height common room and into the garden as well. Next.
Right, so perhaps also should we explain that on the ground floor, well, in Baltimore in housing, I'm not sure I quite explained that part, but it's where care receivers, older and disabled adults, are living with caregivers. And so the ratios, we are in conversation with folks like June and folks from different areas to inform what that ratio looks like.
Mm-hmm. And then this session became also a way to ask, well, how would this block, this Carehaus kind of block, fit within the fabric of detached and attached family homes in Houston? And here we took some examples of typical blocks from the Third Ward in this case, and began to explore different ways in which these could cluster together or stand individually and kind of create more than just a collection of individual buildings.
So yeah, we also just want to point out as, well, it's been an honor to get to work with folks like June, Guillermina, different through these iterative co-design sessions, both to inform and directly shape Carehaus Baltimore, and then help envision what Carehaus Houston would look like, and what does that mean for Latinx families versus Black families, and imagine new possibilities. So yeah,
great.
So
this is great. So thank you all so much. And I'm glad that we still have some people with us to take part in this very brief dialogue. I'm cognizant of the fact that as many of you that are caregivers also have your own families to take care of and cook for, and that are probably waiting there hungry, waiting for dinner. So as I have my own. So so I would love to have a brief dialogue with, among everybody, and then allow Stephen to close us out. And so I think the one observation that I've had throughout these presentations is that what's central to all of them, and this is maybe stating the obvious, but there's a question behind this about collectivity and how essential it has been for those of you who are domestic workers to be together with others, and how much, historically in the labor movement, employers have wanted to prevent that. So I found, June's story in particular, when you did have a supportive employer, to be quite extraordinary. And I wanted to hear if, from those of you who are creating Carehaus, if this question of collectivity also is more of a cultural underpinning to how you're thinking about this. And especially in Houston, what is it about collectivity that you've observed about our culture here in Houston that would inform how you might do this here? Not so much what Rafi was just talking about, because we already heard about it in terms of the architecture, but more the culture of how people would interact at a space.
Can I respond first to that? Yes, I think maybe to say that architecture does play a role here in terms of the scale or the size of where the kind of the collectivity takes shape, because it's a different condition to have some kind of collaboration between 3 or 4, let's say, caregivers that are organized and run one of those buildings and have 9 or 10 elders in that building, and at a scale where collectivity is something that's relatively easy to create between 3 or 4, and not and then if that becomes a unit that can duplicate itself and cluster itself with other units. So we're kind of managing through scaling down, but not eliminating the option to scale up. You see, so I think there is the spaces that we use do shape the way that we interact. And I think design can help make it easier to share or to work collectively.
I wanted to respond to collectivity, and it's kind of picking up on what Lauren said about, displacement and housing displacement is not only about a housing issue, but it's about secondarily, it's about a transportation issue, and it directly affects how people organize and solidarity that is built. And what really struck home for me when you said that, Lauren, was I was reading this book recently called Grand Domestic Revolution, and it was about a 19th century material. So like women reformers who are trying to similarly improve the, to their fault, they were really focused on women needing care and not so much as the workers. And that was one of the downfalls. But one of the key reasons why this movement for collectivity and collectivized housework and collectivized homes was squashed was when industrialists and the car industry lobbied the government to support their cause and create single family dispersed suburban homes, which broke apart women so they could not organize. And we see that all the time in organizing work, where there's these architectural moves to disperse, segregate. So I mean, I think for us, Carehaus is about enabling people to mutualize care, those who need care, but also mutualize each other's labor so that it improves upon the health, which is has historically been neglected and structurally neglected, intentionally neglected for domestic workers.
That is exactly the answer to the question that I was asking, and just so well put. Thank you. So, you know, let's take that a little bit further, and I'd like to hear from Lauren or June about this too. There's this radical move that people, I would think that particularly those in need of care, would need to make to live in an environment like this, coming from our culture, right? And I wonder if you, Lauren and June, would see it that way, you know, because I think that's my perception, is that American culture does not lend itself to this, a lot like what Marisa just said. You know, we're used to living in our own silos. How radical is this in your view, as much as it is logical to Lauren or June?
I'll go ahead and say, while it on its face, it does seem like this radical notion of, you know, prioritizing folks who need care, but also prioritizing the needs and the housing needs of domestic workers. It really does, I feel like, bring back the communal aspect of like Black American life, and even to a certain extent, Black immigrant life, especially Black immigrants who come in this country, and specifically in Houston, Texas, where we have a lot of immigrants in general located on the Southwest side. People move together and they move in communities where there's familiarity, where I may not have access to, you know, universal childcare, but I know that these folks on my street who come from the same country as me, who share the same culture, will step in and fill in the gaps. And that's really what we've always done for each other. We've never really had the ability and the privilege to like kind of lean on these formalized systems, even, you know, de facto or de jure, you know, segregation, or even just, you know, just the basic barriers of, I feel uncomfortable going into this office asking for assistance, but you don't feel that way about asking your neighbor next door. And so having folks housed together in this way, in this system, in this setting, I don't think is that radical. I think it may be radical what comes out of it, the community building, the political strength that comes out of it, even just the improved outcomes and improved health. We need to be together. We're social human beings, we're social creatures, but even just our society, the way it is built to keep us isolated, it does make us very dependent on one another. I think about my own life, for example. I remember I stepped into domestic care work, and I'm just realizing this when my grandfather was ill. I had the most flexibility in my home out of my parents and my siblings. And so I took care of my husband. Now we took care of my grandfather, but that added benefit was that my son got to spend an immense and a beautiful year with his great grandfather. My grandfather was a sharecropper in Huntsville, Texas. He bootlegged liquor. There was amazing stories there. And so my 13-year-old boy got to experience that. So it's not so much just the formalized like idea of, you know, community and these words that we use, but really just that community that is built that improves our outcomes and improves our lives, which is so important. And I'll be quiet now, but I've always thought about how do we fill in those gaps for each other when we're dispersed, you know, throughout cities and in space and time, and it's intentional. And this really will transform the way that we think about living with one another and what it means to be able to be safely in these communities together.
Anyone else want to speak to that? I mean, there's another leap of faith that I heard June talk about, which was this leap into becoming sort of an accidental activist out of necessity. And I think that is sort of another kind of, radical leap that someone has to make in their story that, in their life story that is perhaps similar for some people for whom this model is very unfamiliar, that they would also need to take to live in an environment like this.
Yeah, correction, not an accidental activist. I've always been involved in activism work in the church, right? And later on, I was one of the brave young women to leave my country and to fight and to bring attention to gay men be killed in Jamaica. So I've always, so coming back to the US, I literally got involved again because of the death of Trayvon Martin. That's how I got involved with the Miami Workers Center. Yeah, and then later on the domestic workers movement. The Carehaus concept to me is very interesting. I was in Switzerland last year, we forget about that year. So it would have been 2019, and I literally had a meeting at this kind of like Carehaus. It's an apartment complex where folks, disabled and older theologians, they literally came together and live in this beautiful community house where, they have their dining areas, they have their garden, and so they look after each other in that that kind of what I would call now, they call it co-op living. And another friend of mine just moved from her apartment into a co-op living right now. So for me, Carehaus, when I first heard about Carehaus, I was completely blown away. And the meeting that we had where we spoke about what it would look like for care workers, the fact that care workers will be able to live, there with their clients. And the part that blew me away was that they make the care workers, if they have a child or children, they would be able to look after their children, while they're living in this community, because oftentimes domestic workers, when they have their own children at home, by the time they get from work, the buses, they are too tired. And sometimes they don't even, when they get home, their kids are already sleeping. They don't see their children until the end of the week. So I really like this concept and this idea. I like the fact that it's going to be a reality in Baltimore. And I'm really excited about and to see what's going to happen over in, and I think it's a radical move, really. As I said, I've seen this in Switzerland, and it coming to the United States, and the way it's been pulled together by brilliant people, artists, and so on. For me, that's brilliant and extremely radical. Yeah.
Excellent. Stephen, I want to hand it over to you because you didn't have a chance to talk very much about Blaffer, and I also know you want to close us out.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry to be the one to have to end this conversation, but I'm just so grateful to everyone who's participated. I want to thank June and Lauren for all the work that you do. Truly, we are grateful to what you bring to this community, to the cities that you live in, and everything that you do. I want to thank Karen for being the catalyst to bring Marisa to Houston. And I want to thank Marisa and Rafi for all the work that they've done and all the community collaborators and organizations that they've already brought together. And I truly hope that we will see more of you and that we'll see you continuing, and that Carehaus can become part of Houston in the very near future. And I also want to just to kind of close out, to also encourage everyone, if you have enjoyed the discussion tonight, we are doing another panel discussion tomorrow night, and that will be led by another artist in residence, Sean Leonardo. And he will be speaking with the director of 8 Million Stories, an incredibly important third ward-based organization in Houston. And so Sean and Marvin will be in conversation, as well as Dr. Elwyn Lee, who's the VP of Neighborhood and Strategic Initiatives here at UH and has done incredibly formative work in his own career. So we are just, again, so pleased. Thank you, Karen, for bringing these artists to Houston and all the work that they can do here. So thank all of you for joining us, and please stay tuned and continue to support these great artists and the communities around you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody,
Bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.